Hi, friends. Thanks for slogging through the rain. Thanks for being here tonight. This is an evening to celebrate a great man. And before we do that, I got to give a little bit of words from our sponsors, so to speak. And so President Gibson talked about the King's College, where we are. I wanted to mention the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute, which is one of the co-hosts, and worked with the National Review Institute to make this evening happen. So as director of the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute here at King's, we've created several programs for journalism that help train high school students, undergrads, and some working journalists in the city. We have also a program for visiting students, and our goal is to help young people understand what journalism is and how it works and how to consider it as a career option. And we have academic programs that help them do that. We also honor the legacy of another great man named McCandlish Phillips in our title. And so he was a legendary reporter at the New York Times for about 21 years, actually during the same time frame, the same vintage, let's say, as William F. Buckley. And one of the things, by the way, I'll tell my quick anecdote about Buckley, because I want us to hear from the panelists especially, but also from questioners, thoughts about Buckley. I want us I hope we can bring some collective memory to who he was. And so my memory, one of them was as a young person, I worked at the Indianapolis News on the editorial page, and I had to edit his syndicated column, which went out to 300 some newspapers. And so I was familiar with the man's language and how hard sometimes it was to write headlines for his columns and to cut them to space and such. And then a few years later, I was at the University of South Dakota, where I was from, where I got a scholarship to go to college. And the political science chair, Bill Richardson, a virtue theorist, he brought Buckley to campus, one of my heroes he brought to campus. We had 1,000 people, in South Dakota of all places. It packed the halls. We had a dinner with Buckley. And Dr. Richardson, one of my mentors, asked me if I would drive him to Sioux City, Iowa, from Vermilion, a half-hour drive to Sioux City, Iowa. And I said, sure, absolutely. But then I was a little intimidated, spending a half hour in a car with Buckley. It was a blizzard. I just wanted to stay on the road. I didn't want to have anything bad happen. And Dr. Richardson's wife said, hey, I sat next to William F. Buckley at dinner, and he loves talking about, editing pins and English muffins, what kind of English muffins and peanut butter he uses and stuff. So we talked about that kind of random, what I call life hacks on the way, in addition to politics and policy. And fastest drive ever, but I learned one life hack, which I pass on to our students here. Every student in my persuasive writing, and I think Professor Lisi's persuasive writing, we make them read and present on famous writers, including Buckley. And I tell them one of the tips Buckley gave me during that ride was, when it comes to wine at the dinner table, you don't have to buy more than $10. You don't have to spend more than $10 for a bottle of wine. This was, 2000, I guess, late 90s, early 2000s. But it was a great life hack. And it helps open up wine to new wine drinkers, that you don't have to spend tons of money to get a great bottle of wine. So he went on about it. We could talk, and maybe we'll hear more about that from panelists. So the last thing I want to tell you, so my question, did Buckley and McCandlish Phillips know each other, these two great men? So I did a little bit of research and found very quickly today at least two instances where not only did McCandlish Phillips as a Metro reporter at the New York Times, he interviewed Buckley a few times and wrote about his campaign and his brother's campaign when Buckley was running for mayor of New York and his brother was running for a senator seat. But this was a piece in National Review by Neil Freeman in 2015 on William F. Buckley Jr.'s run for mayor 50 years later. And I wanted to read this. I can't tell you which hour of which day it happened, but the press narrative began finally to shift. Freeman was saying that the New York Times wasn't treating Buckley very well on that initial campaign. So he said, at first a few reporters and then more, and then at last the full mewling herd began to concede that maybe, just maybe, Bill's was a serious campaign. One reporter, the legendary McCandlish Phillips of the New York Times, began to toy with another idea. Perhaps Bill's was the only serious campaign. So McCandlish Phillips wrote, at first a few reporters and then more, and then at last the few mewling herd began to concede that maybe, just maybe, Bill's was a serious campaign. That was in McCandlish's piece. And then there was another wonderful piece which we printed, and we have it somewhere here for you to pick up from the New York Times, a different piece that was from 1970 that McCandlish Phillips did an extensive interview with Buckley, writing about his brother's Senate campaign and reflecting on William F. Buckley's Jr.'s mayoral campaign. And here's just a paragraph that I liked from that piece. Another common trait is the easy ability of a Buckley to convey the impression that he or she likes you instantly and that you ought, by all means, to return that liking in kind. The Buckleys, political friends and enemies agree, possess more than ordinary quantities of charm and wit, quick intelligence, and just a touch of aristocratic elegance. Their conservatism is a matter of belief, not manner, and their bearing is a wide sweep away from the stolidity that has sometimes been associated with the philosophy. You should read the rest of the piece. There's many good insights, but we first need to get to our panelists who worked with Buckley, knew Buckley in different contexts, and are committed to preserving the legacy of William F. Buckley. So I'm just going to tell you who we're going to hear from, and then I'm going to introduce the first speaker. We're going to hear from Lauren Noble tonight, who's founder and executive director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale. We're going to hear from James Panero, who's writer, editor, and critic, executive editor of the new Criterion. We're going to hear from Larry Perelman, who knows Buckley from another context, and we'll let him tell that story. And he works in the classical music industry, and I'll tell you more about his background. But first, we're going to hear from someone who's inherited William F. Buckley's legacy at the magazine William F. Buckley started, Rich Lowry. So Rich is one of the most respected conservative voices. He brings his sharp analysis, his well-formed opinions to the political discussions through his writing and commentary. He became editor of National Review in 1999 when William F. Buckley Jr. selected him to lead the magazine. NR remains a conservative guidepost, helping to bring to prominence rising conservative leaders and to advance conservative policies. Rich Lowry is a syndicated columnist, a political commentator with CNN. His insight and analysis can be found in Politico as well, where he writes a weekly column. You can see him debating often on Meet the Press and on This Week with George Stephanopoulos. He's written many books, including Lincoln Unbound, which follows Abraham Lincoln's climb to the presidency and distills lessons from his ethic of relentless striving. I know he's spoken here at King's about that book before. He also has another book on Bill Clinton, Legacy, Paying the Price for the Clinton Years, which was a New York Times bestseller. So let's welcome Rich Lowry to talk to us about his friend and mentor.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, and thanks to King's College and the National Review Institute for hosting this event. It's a pleasure always to be here in Bill de Blasio's New York, a city that encapsulates Bill Buckley's axiom that liberals don't care what you do so long as it's mandatory. I'm a Buckley acolyte going way back. I discovered Bill Buckley through his long-running show Firing Line, and I became obsessed with it so long ago. You actually had VCRs back then, and I'd record the program and watch it religiously as a teenager and rewind parts to make sure I was understanding the finer points of the debate and the vocabulary words. As you can tell, I wasn't a very well-adjusted or popular teenager, but through Firing Line, I discovered National Review. I would literally sneak National Review into my classrooms and read it in between the covers of my textbooks. So what Playboy was to most kids my age, National Review was to me. And it's really hard in the current media environment where there's been such a great diffusion to grasp the imprint that Bill Buckley had on journalism and our national life. There is an old Soviet joke that there was a province of the Soviet Union that liked to brag. We currently have 256 authors churning out material every single day, when in the backward czarist times in this province, they only had one writer named Leo Tolstoy. And that's a little bit the way Bill Buckley is with our current media environment. He was the George Will of his time, the most important conservative columnist. He was the Tim Russert of his time, the late Tim Russert, the most important media interviewer. He was the Rush Limbaugh of his time, the most important conservative popularizer, and the David Remnick of his time, the most important editor. And he brought to all this incredibly appealing affect and attitude, this polemical brio, this winning smile, this joyous wordplay, and this high-flying lifestyle. He was unabashedly highbrow. A friend invited him to a baseball game once, and he said, "No thanks, I've already seen one." He didn't know Oprah Winfrey's name. I heard him refer to her as, "Who is the woman who is alternately slender and fat?" He had an abiding interest in people, a great gift for friendship, and was always unabashedly himself with his exotic manner and accent. Actually, his son, Chris Buckley, says it wasn't until he was a teenager that he fully realized that his family was actually American. But the most important thing about Bill was just his abiding belief in the power of ideas. And that's the most important thing about him. That's the most important part of his legacy. Although I have to say, in recent years, my faith in that belief in ideas has been shaken a little bit. I don't want to talk a lot about Donald Trump, and some of you might know I've had a complicated relationship with Donald Trump, although there might have been kind of a warming last year around this time of year. I went back to my office after a break, and I found this brown envelope from the White House on my desk, and I was quite curious what this was. I opened it up, and it was a ripped-out copy of one of my columns that had run in the New York Post. And I consider the New York Post the nation's newspaper, and more importantly, the President of the United States considers it the nation's newspaper. And I'd written this column after last year's off-year elections about the Virginia gubernatorial race, where the Republican candidate Ed Gillespie did everything he could possible to disassociate himself from Donald Trump. So basically, I've met the guy, I've never talked to the guy, please stop asking me questions about the guy, and still got wiped out by these suburban voters in Virginia who would have crawled over broken glass to send a message to Donald Trump by voting against Ed Gillespie. So I wrote a column just about what a dominating presence Trump is in our politics and our culture, so there's really no escape from him, for better or worse, for Republicans. And I had a lot of, I thought, really incisive and somewhat harsh observations about the political effect Trump was having on the party. That made no impression on him. What caught his eye was the headline that the editors of the Post had put on the column, which was, "There is only Trump." And Trump, in his signature style, had taken out this black Sharpie, circled the headline, pointed this huge arrow to it, and wrote on top, "Rich, so true, Donald J. Trump." Yeah. That's been the story of my life, like the last 3 years. But so while Trump was rising, I'd look at these bookshelves in my office groaning under these conservative tomes, all of which are a lot of them about the power of ideas. And I was, what ideas? This guy is just dominating through the sheer force of his personality. But I've come to realize that I was too pessimistic in that period. Because if you look, for instance, at the area where I think, in conservative terms, Trump has been at his most effective and at his best, it has been in nominating conservative judges to the Supreme Court and elsewhere on the bench. Now, is this because Trump himself cares deeply about the finer points of the Constitution and our system? Probably not. But it's because the intellectual work over the course of decades has been done on this issue, making the case for originalism, nurturing conservative judges who believe in originalism. This is the work of Antonin Scalia, of the Federalist Society. And what Trump has really done has moved in the slipstream of that intellectual effort, which shows how important it is to make that effort. You want to have off-the-shelf ideas and movements that successful politicians can pick up, and that's what's happened with Trump and the judiciary. Now, it's been a divisive time on the right, but it's a little bit of a myth that there was ever a time of great unity on the right. There's always been different strands of conservatism, and one of the roles of National Review and Buckley was always to air out that debate. And people very often ask me, what would Buckley think of Trump, or what would he think of this moment? He's so idiosyncratic, it's impossible to know. But I do know he'd want us to embrace this internal debate. At National Review, he ran libertarians who basically believed that stoplights are a statist atrocity, and he ran people who wore capes and lederhosen and yearned for the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he'd want us to embrace the debate over what role populism should have in our movement, over what conservative policies we can advance that can actually advance the interests of the American working class, and he'd want us to debate what are the prerogatives of the nation state and national sovereignty vis-a-vis global markets. And finally, he would want us to take on the two really big challenges of our time. And if you look back in retrospect, after 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the victory over the Soviets, conservatives in general just made two mistakes. We thought, one, that international communism was dead, and two, we thought domestic socialism was dead. And Red China and the rise of socialism at this moment proved that both of those were wrong, and the task remains to us to crush the Politburo, but this time not in Moscow, but in Beijing, and to crush and discredit and frog march socialism back to Vermont and Berkeley, California, where it belongs. And just, in conclusion, you can applaud that. That's okay. You don't have to feel guilty. So one of Bill's loveliest passages was about one of his most important themes, which is the importance of gratitude. And I think this passage captures how we, in our turn, should regard Bill Buckley and his legacy. He said, "To fail to experience gratitude when walking through the corridors in the Metropolitan Museum, when listening to the music of Bach or Beethoven, when exercising our freedom to speak, is to fail to recognize how much we have received from the great wellsprings of human talent and concern that gave us Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, our parents, our friends. We need a rebirth of gratitude for those who've cared for us, living and mostly dead. The high moments of our way of life are their gifts to us. We must remember them in our thoughts and prayers and in our deeds." Thank you very much.
I am now very grateful and very pleased to be able to call on Mr. William F. Buckley, Jr. to speak forth to this motion.
By saying that you wouldn't have resisted Hitler in 1933 because there was a communist menace.
No,
is
it is not
point?
saying that.
Well, why isn't it?
Because there's no parallel between Hitler and Ho Chi Minh.
Well, I think there's a considerable parallel because some people try to excuse their defense of Hitler on the grounds that there was a crisis in Germany, and you're trying to excuse Ho Chi Minh, who is a very... no, but you are trying to excuse Ho Chi Minh, who is a considerable butcher on a very large scale, on the grounds that something that Indochina had something worse to fear than Ho Chi Minh. Aren't you saying that?
Well, as far as Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people were concerned, it had something considerably worse to fear.
I'm talking about you.
Yes, I think it had. It had French colonialism.
Which was worse than Ho Chi Minh.
Undoubtedly, it might have been if it had continued much longer because of the entirety of the 9-year war that followed it.
I'm talking about whether it was. Or do you, by the way, let's get this straight, do you dispute the statistics about the extent of the butchery of Ho Chi Minh? Or are you saying that he didn't, in fact, kill the 50 or 60,000 people in North Vietnam, which even he subsequently apologized?
Definitely killed.
He did kill them?
Definitely, yes.
And did the French kill 50 or 60,000 people? I'm not talking about wars. Everybody kills everybody in wars, but I mean during peacetime?
Well, we're talking about a war that was going on from 1946 to 1954, in which the 50,000 people were indeed killed, right?
No, I'm not.
You're talking about the period after 1954?
Yes, yeah.
Well,
I'm talking about the great carnages post-1954.
Yes.
that caused this great refugee traffic to come south.
Well, that was not the only reason for the refugee traffic to come
what was
south.
the other reason?
The fact that there were 900,000 of those people going south were Catholics who felt that they could live better under the regime in the south because of Godin Diem being a Catholic.
Well, there are an awful lot of people
And I believe Ho Chi Minh is not a Catholic.
Well, but there are an awful lot of people who are Catholics who don't leave a country simply because it's not governed by... There are 6 million Catholics in England. I'm not aware that any of them have left, even though it's a church-state situation there.
Well, do you feel that the Queen is as oppressive as Ho?
No, that's just it. And I'm quite sure.
Thanks to Peter Freeby today for pulling some old firing line clips that we're going to intersperse between our speakers this evening. So, because we want to get a sense of the voice, the reason, the personality, the style, and the image of William F. Buckley this evening. Our next speaker, James Panero, is a writer, editor, and critic. He's executive editor of the New Criterion. He writes on Culture Monthly and serves as the magazine's art critic. He's contributed to a number of other publications, including the Wall Street Journal, City Journal, New York Magazine, and the New York Times Book Review. His own books include the Dartmouth Review Pleads Innocent from ISI Books, and which is an anthology of from that conservative student newspaper. And in the winter of '99, he lived with William F. Buckley Jr. in Switzerland. I think he may tell us a bit about that. He was a writing assistant for the thriller called Spy Time, The Undoing of James Jesus Angleton. So let's welcome up James Panero.
Thanks very much. Boy, I love watching those old firing lines. I feel like I can binge watch them all night long. For all of Buckley's contributions to conservative ideas, his most striking contribution is to the conservative personality. He made being conservative attractive and even glamorous. Now, that's what David Brooks said of Bill Buckley, and I think he's right. Conservatism is not a theory, after all. From Edmund Burke to Russell Kirk, much has been written about America and its conservative roots. Yet there is no one conservative manifesto, no mantra of conservative orthodoxy. And this is true for Buckley himself, our most prominent and prolific conservative voice of the last century. The reason? Because conservatism is closer to a disposition than a computation. Kirk wrote of the conservative mind. Buckley revealed the conservative personality and shared it with virtuosic joy. Briefly, as you heard, here's a story of how I saw this personality in action, and as you will also see, it's an account of a very fortunate 22-year-old. The winter after my senior year in college, Buckley invited me to Gstaad, Switzerland, to help him on a novel called Spy Time, The Undoing of James Jesus Angleton. Our program there followed much of what he had been doing each year. For a little over a month, he and his wife Pat and a small staff took over a chalet in the ski area in a village called Rougemont. Somewhere in Switzerland, Bill had stored a crate of old dictionaries, video cassettes of Brideshead Revisited, abstract paintings, and leopard print throws. In the days before his arrival, the staff used these items to convert the chalet into another Buckley office and home. And each year, Bill brought along a young college graduate to be his writing assistant. He put us up in an inn just down the hill. I had first met Buckley as the undergraduate editor of the Dartmouth Review. My advisor, Jeffrey Hart, showed him a piece I'd written, I think it was a movie review, and Buckley wrote back approvingly. That translated into an internship at NR and then an editorial job as a colleague of an even younger Rich Lowry. I'd only met Buckley a handful of times when he called me into his office and asked me if I liked to ski. I said, "Yes, Mr. Buckley, I do." He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Call me Bill." The invitation to Switzerland came the next day. "There's never a good time for a busy man to take a vacation," Bill once said, and since there is never a good time, he might as well take it whenever he wants. But Bill never vacationed, even on vacation. He never took weekends off, most likely because his greatest fear was boredom. So Bill gave himself the assignment of writing a book, often a work of fiction, each year during his stay in Gstaad. The winter I was there, it wasn't one of his Blackford Oaks novels, but it was a Cold War thriller. The book was a fictionalized first-person story as told by James Angleton, the real-life head of U.S. counterintelligence. Angleton's arch enemy in our book, as in real life, was Kim Philby, the famous double agent from the British Secret Service. Philby had been recruited by the Communists as one of the Cambridge Five and defected in 1963 to the Soviet Union, where he was awarded the Order of Lenin. For Angleton, Philby was the spy who got away, and our novel hinted that it drove Angleton insane. So in Stade, while everyone else went on holiday, we made a novel. Bill woke up at 4:30 every morning. I drove up to the chalet, overlooking the mountain face of the Ville Manette at 7:30. Bill always lent out his four-wheel drive Peugeot to his young assistants, and he handed me the keys our first day at the top of the hill and gave me a quiz about the route to get his morning newspaper. I didn't want to admit I couldn't drive stick, so I learned on the road from my hotel to the chalet and burned out the clutch. We worked for several hours together every morning, our desks catty-corner to each other. The Goldberg Variations, the early Glenn Gould recordings, played in the background as Bill typed. If Bill wanted to set a scene in Beirut in the 1960s, he had me to come up with the details. Then we went to lunch in one of the hamlets dotting the resort or in the private restaurant atop the Vossengrat called the Eagle Club. Here we discussed what should happen next in the plot. How about we hide a gun in the camera? Let's kill off so-and-so. He had very little sense of where his book would go. Then we would ski for a few hours. Then we would return for the afternoon writing session. Buckley had it in him to write 1,500 words a day. After a month, you had a novel. But those 1,500 words needed a second pair of eyes, and that's where I came in. In his first drafts, character names changed, dates were all wrong. I helped fix those in the afternoon sessions. Then at 7 p.m., Julian, his cook, brought in a kir, which is white wine with a drop of creme de cassis, for each of us. We'd pull out the Dutch cigars and discuss the day's progress. Things moved quickly into evening. The Buckleys almost always included me in their entertaining, which was Pat's full-time job in Stade since she didn't ski. Where should we seat the Princess of Denmark, the actor Roger Moore, the pretender to the throne of Greece, the would-be Tsar of Russia? And Julian, do we have enough foie de canard for everyone? James, Bill would say, you sit here next to me. As every young person learned around Bill, he always wanted to hear your opinion, even if you didn't have a good one. To close out the night, he would have me sing standards while he accompanied me on the piano, and this promptly cleared out the house. He liked to be in bed by 10, and we repeated it all the next day. In Miles Gone By, Bill's most personal collection of essays, and one that I recommend to all, he devotes more than one chapter to his childhood music instruction. In addition to weekly piano tutorials, the Buckley children were exposed to an hour of phonograph listening 4 times a week by a tutor named Penelope Oyen. Bill tells us that, quote, Miss Oyen loved music with a passion. The use of that word here is not platitudinous, because Penelope Oyen would weep when listening to music. Not always, not for every composer, but almost always for J.S. Bach. I believed her when she said that music is very serious business, as poetry is very serious business, as art of any sort is very, very serious business. That which is sublime can't be anything less. Now, certainly this sense for the sublime connected with his faith in God. Bill was born into the good life, but his interest was in the eternal life. His greatest regret, he said late in life, was that he wasn't better at prayer. Bill was never a master at the piano, but he was a great virtuoso. In Switzerland, like a sort of music appreciation, Bill was giving out Buckley appreciation. Bill found music in words. He played them into his writing, channeling Bach through the computer keyboard. He was probably second only to Shakespeare in bringing words into circulation. Why do you want to be a party to diminishing the choices that you have when you're dealing with a language which you worship for its beauty, he said. This virtuosity, combined with his great vocal presence, which we saw. Wilmore Kendall once said that Buckley could do as much with his voice as Laurence Olivier. I'm still amazed how much he shared these gifts with someone who was an entry-level editor and how he believed in my help. Even when we were together in Stade and emphysema was taking its toll on him, his talents were dazzling. A sort of personal ebulliency sustains me, he once said in an interview. Bill Buckley's unabashed life performance was his answer to the fallen century he had been born into, which he was determined to stand athwart. At the heart of this conservatism was this great generosity to convey beauty and joy through example, to reach across generations, and to have us close enough to listen in. Thank you.
Your producer wrote me an irresistible letter. He said, he's an irresistible fellow. What did he say? Well, to begin with, he promised to fly me out in an airplane with 2 right wings.
To have someone say, well, no, these are new standards now, much like cruel and unusual punishment, suddenly we think vivisection is okay for shoplifting. I think that isn't the case. If what
Hold
the president...
it 1 minute. Nobody, as I recall, suggested that Thomas be impeached. It was
They
a question
suggested he not be put
whether
in
he
his
should
job.
be approved for a promotion. Now, I don't think anybody suggests that if Clinton was up for promotion, in this atmosphere they would promote him.
Well, they aren't as different as...
Promotion and impeachment?
It's not so much promotion. It was a question of whether he was fit for the office. And that is what impeachment is about. And in fact, for the president...
My memory is moderately reliable on this. I don't think anybody said Clarence Thomas should not only not go to the Supreme Court, but we want to knock him out of the Court of Appeals where he sat. Did they?
Yes, but there are different standards for what office it is you're fit for. Just as you would expect a man to be more fit for the Supreme Court rather than an appellate court, the president is especially supposed to be fit.
My question is, did they think that the charge that you just finished reciting was sufficient to pull him out, i.e. to impeach him from his existing role?
More glimpses of Buckley. I think we're seeing, too, from some of the speakers, the kind of mentor that Buckley was. And our next speaker is, life is involved in taking that forward. And that's Lauren Noble, who's founded and is executive director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale, which she started as a senior in college. She graduated from Yale in 2011 with a bachelor's in history. From 2011 to 2012, Lauren worked as a research analyst and communications staffer on the Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. She's a recipient of the National Association of Scholars 2013 Barry R. Gross Memorial Award for academic reform, and she's written for outlets such as the Wall Street Journal and National Review Online. So please welcome Lauren.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. When I first received the invitation to be here with you all this evening, I was honored, but I must confess I was a bit intimidated. I never had the privilege of meeting William F. Buckley Jr., and so to appear alongside Rich, Larry, and James, all people the Buckley Program has turned to for insights on William F. Buckley Jr., was at first thought a bit daunting. But as I thought about the question before us, it occurred to me that my presence here tonight speaks to the enduring impact of William F. Buckley Jr. He inspired countless young people, even those whom he did not know, to take up the conservative cause. Can you name any other journalist, television host, or author with that kind of influence? Even with dozens of books, thousands of columns, and episodes of Firing Line, and regular speeches around the country, Buckley was not merely prolific and eloquent. He was an institution builder, most notably, of course, of National Review, but also organizations such as Young Americans for Freedom and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. These and other institutions he touched continue to shape generations of conservatives. In speaking to his political legacy, I can do no better than George Will, who neatly summarized his impact as follows. Without Bill Buckley, no National Review. Without National Review, no Goldwater nomination. Without the Goldwater nomination, no conservative takeover of the Republican Party. Without that, no Reagan. Without Reagan, no victory in the Cold War. Therefore, Bill Buckley won the Cold War. Again, can you name any journalist or public intellectual with a legacy of such significance? I first discovered William F. Buckley Jr. in high school. I don't recall knowing any conservatives growing up in Concord, Massachusetts. I started reading National Review for a steady diet of insights and inspiration. I may have been a political anomaly in Concord, but the magazine reminded me that I was not alone. During my freshman year at Yale, I read God and Man at Yale, Buckley's first book published in 1951. As it happened, Buckley passed away a couple of months later. While I regretted never having the opportunity to meet him, a few years later, I enrolled in a seminar on his life and the rise of modern conservatism in the fall of my senior year, taught by Buckley biographer Al Felsenberg. It changed my life in a way I could not have predicted at the time. Inspired by Buckley's example and sensing a need for some diversity of thought on campus, I set out to establish a forum for conservative ideas at Yale. Within a semester, and with the help of some friends, the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale was born. At a critical time for free expression on college campuses nationwide, I'm happy and proud that the Buckley program has been able to offer a principled yet cheerful alternative to intellectual stagnation and conformity, hosting hundreds of speakers and events, including firing line debates, conferences, lectures, seminars, and more, introducing thousands of students to the ideas that Buckley championed. The eager help I received in building that organization offered a powerful testament to Buckley the man and his generosity, especially with young people. Speaking of college campuses, here's the second point I want to make. Buckley devoted a great deal of energy to not only dismantling the arguments of the liberal establishment, but also to helping conservatives compete for elite institutions. Yes, he had the famous one-liners, such as the one about preferring to be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone book rather than the Harvard faculty. But let's not forget that this is someone who started his illustrious career by talking about Yale, and he even later sought a spot on its board of trustees. And look at the institutions he formed. They're all about persuasion, about education. Upon founding National Review, Buckley wrote, "The inroads that relativism has made on the American soul are not so easily evident. One must have lived on or close to a college campus to have a vivid intimation of what has happened. It is there that we see how a number of energetic social innovators, plugging their grand designs, succeeded over the years in capturing the liberal intellectual imagination. And since ideas rule the world, the ideologues, having won over the intellectual class, simply walked in and started to run things." His faith in the power of ideas, as Rich was speaking about, really animated many of the ambitious projects he undertook. Buckley even ran for mayor of New York City in 1965 on the Conservative Party ticket. When asked what he would do if he won, Buckley famously quipped, "Demand a recount." He ended up earning 13% of the vote in a three-way race. The following year, he launched a television show, Firing Line, which for 33 years offered its viewers a spirited and intelligent exchange of opinions. Buckley engaged with and challenged those with whom he disagreed: socialists, unionists, feminists, activists, journalists, economists, you name it. To be sure, not everyone accepted the invitation to appear on Firing Line. When asked why Robert Kennedy declined, Buckley retorted, "Why does baloney reject the grinder?" Through Firing Line, he proved that conservative ideas could not only compete against the prevailing liberal orthodoxies of the day, but also win the argument and have a good time doing so. He popularized the principles of limited government and individual liberty by bringing them into the living rooms of people across the nation. Buckley made conservatism respectable and even chic. These are petulant political times in America, and there's a lot, I think, that we can and should learn from Buckley. One, as Rich was saying, he welcomed debate within the conservative movement, publishing a range of voices in National Review. He himself even famously debated Ronald Reagan on the Panama Canal. Two, he was unafraid to expel...
Good evening, 52 Broadway.
Two, he was unafraid to expel those disreputable voices, such as maybe that sound, George Wallace, anti-Semites, and other bigots. But most important, though, and what I think sometimes conservatives have forgotten, is the way in which he was both a person of ideas and actions. He once wrote, quote, that the so-called conservative, uncomfortably disdainful of controversy, seldom has the energy to fight his battles, while the radical, so often a member of the minority, exerts disproportionate influence because of his dedication to his cause. Buckley had the necessary dedication to his cause, and he had the energy to fight his battles. And he did so as a happy warrior with civility, wit, and class. He did not confine himself to an echo chamber. What a fabulous and needed model for conservatives today. Thank you so much.
It's so cool what you're doing, Lauren, at Yale. It's great to hear your context on William Buckley, Bill Buckley, we should say. We've got a clip I guess we're going to play it after our next speaker talks and reveals to us another side of Bill Buckley. So Larry Perelman was born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1976 after his parents immigrated from the Soviet Union 7 months before. He moved to Manhattan in 1994 to pursue a career as a concert pianist at Manhattan School of Music. And after 2 years, realized he was more entrepreneurial and wanted to pursue that instead of solo studies. So he went back to St. Paul, finished school at McCandlish College, double majoring in political science and music. The same year, he received a research grant from Bill Buckley to research the impact the removal of music education in the 1970s had on several generations of New York City public school students. That grant brought Larry back to New York later in '99, allowed him to pursue his aim of classical music's place in the cultural landscape, and I think fits with NR's motto that it's a journal of politics and culture, that Buckley was someone who got the importance of culture. And so Larry's continued that work. He is managing director of Semantix Creative Group, based here in New York, a strategic advisory firm he's run since 2006, advising leading performing arts institutions, companies, and artists with a focus in particular on classical music. You'll recognize many of the big names that he represents, from the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra to Medici TV, the Salzburg Festival, and several conductors and people I'll let him tell you about so I don't mangle their names. Larry got an MBA from Columbia Business School, and I'll say, that's how I met Larry. We were in a class together, and when Bill Buckley died, I was binge watching, like James was talking about, videos and reading tributes, and I came across one in National Review by a guy named Larry Perelman, and I read it, and I said, wait a second, this sounds like the guy who's in my class. So I talked to him 2 days later in class, and I felt like there was an instant bond formed on sort of next generation people who cared about Buckley, and his story is amazing. Let's welcome Larry.
Thanks, Paul. And it's been really a wonderful opportunity to hear these stories again. Many of these very, very close friends over the years through Bill, and to reminisce about Bill is always a great honor. So I thank the college here and everyone for attending and for listening to this. With this fire alarm going on, it's a little bit like being on the firing line, so we'll get through this quickly. So it's always an honor to reminisce about the great William F. Buckley, Jr., whom I had the honor to know from 1995 until the night before he passed away, when we had an unforgettable dinner. This friendship changed the course of my life, and I would need much more time than the allotted time here to tell you about it. However, let's start with music, because this was at the root of our friendship. I'm the beneficiary of a classic New York story. I arrived in New York in 1994 to study to become a concert pianist. I had few friends when I moved here, but being an enterprising 18-year-old, I did have a dream of meeting William F. Buckley, Jr. Having grown up during the Reagan years as the child of Soviet Jewish immigrants, I was a fervent anti-communist and very aware of William F. Buckley, Jr. in National Review at an early age. I sat down one day in October 1994 and wrote Bill a letter expressing my gratitude to him for having emboldened Soviet Jews to come to America and make it here. I asked him for the opportunity to say thank you to him by playing a piano recital for him in private, and I sent off the letter to National Review. Within a few days, I followed up with his office. I was very impatient. I wanted an answer right away. And I encountered someone who some of us in this room remember, his very intimidating executive assistant, Frances Bronson. I managed to get through to her on the phone and ask if Mr. Buckley received my letter. Her reply was very curt. "How'd we know? He receives hundreds of letters every week," she said in her English accent. My reply was simple. "I'm the 18-year-old pianist." She softened up a bit and said, "Oh yes, we did receive your letter, and he'll reply in due course." Then she hung up. 1 week later, a letter from Buckley arrived. Little did I know that it would become my version of the Willy Wonka golden ticket. For in many ways, Bill Buckley was a Willy Wonka to us all and opened extraordinary worlds to each of us. For me, he was the gateway to New York City and believed in my passion for classical music and its place in our society. Bill would often tell me how music was his great love and that he just didn't have the talent to pursue a career as a pianist or a harpsichordist. I've decided to slightly adapt an article I wrote for National Review Online the day after Bill died. It is entitled "The Last Supper" with WFB. I recently returned from Stamford, Connecticut, where I had been scheduled to play Beethoven's Diabelli Variations for Bill and his friends on Wednesday night, February 27, 2008. Instead, I find myself writing this tribute to my dear friend and mentor, who has just passed away. He knew well that he was the most important person in my life after the two people who had actually given me life. Bill and I had dinner last night, and I've chosen to write about this because I'd like for his family, friends, colleagues, and readers to know that it was just like any other Buckley dinner. It started with cocktails and ended with cognac. Bill invited me to have dinner with him and then to spend the next morning and afternoon practicing before giving my performance. Bill and I had a tradition where he would choose the next work for me to learn and perform for National Review editors and friends of his and Pat's. Over the years, I've played at least a dozen recitals with works by Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, and Schubert. I arrived at Bill's at about 6 p.m. Before leaving for Stanford, Linda Bridges, another remarkable National Review personality and editor who in Bill's final years also ran his office, told me he wasn't feeling well and might not be up for dinner that evening. However, as I approached the music room, I heard Bill's oxygen machine roaring over the sounds of the evening news he was watching. At this point, he was suffering from emphysema. Opening the door, I saw Bill tinkering with the remote control, not an uncommon sight. A soda and a mixed drink with orange juice on the table nearby. Everything seemed to be normal. The music room has a glorious harpsichord and a large sofa, and its walls are lined with bookcases all around, save for the large windows offering breathtaking views of Long Island Sound. I gently placed my hand on Bill's shoulder, and he looked up. In his trademark smile, he uttered, "Hey, buddy," a salutation his friends know well. He immediately asked what I'd like to drink, and I chose red wine. He rang the kitchen staff to bring the wine. Dinner festivities had officially begun. I made myself comfortable on the couch next to Bill, and we chatted about some odds and ends. I'd ventured out to Bill's the previous week so that I could, as he said, premiere the Diabelli Variations for Bill and members of his families. That afternoon would turn out to be the last gathering of Bill and his siblings. He loved the Diabelli Variations and convinced me to learn it after an initial hesitancy on my part. I mentioned to Bill what an honor it was for me to perform it for him, and he conveyed his delight and noted the impression that my, in his words, sweet mother had made on the gathering. She happened to be visiting from Minnesota, and Bill, being a consummate gentleman, not only invited her to come along, but also had her sit by him at lunch. The first course of our dinner arrived, and it was simply red caviar and creme fraiche on toasted baguette. Bill inquired, "Would you like some vodka?" I replied in the affirmative. Bill then raised his shot glass and I mine, which followed with a clink and swift consumption of the perfectly chilled vodka. I found it incredible that here we were toasting with chilled vodka while watching news footage of the New York Philharmonic's visit to North Korea, one of the last vestiges of communism. As mentioned before, my parents and family fled the Soviet Union in the 70s, and I was the first American-born child in my family. It was surreal that here we were 13 years after having met, toasting to all good things with vodka and red caviar. It was very special, and soon our glasses were refilled. The second course arrived as the sounds of Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto filled the room. Bill reminisced about concerts he had heard in the 1930s. Specifically, he mentioned hearing this, his favorite concerto, performed in London in 1938. He then turned to me and asked, "Do you think the harpsichord is today facing its greatest challenge as a concert instrument?" This was classic Bill, a curveball pitch when you least expected it. I was far from being an authority on the harpsichord. Bill was one himself, but I agreed with his observation. In front of us stood one of Bill's harpsichords, indeed one of his prized possessions. Our conversation ranged from politics to culture to mutual friends. James Panero, for one. James and I had met on Bill's boat, Petito, in 2001 on a sail to Oyster Bay. We were 25 and are best friends to this day. I mentioned to Bill that if not for him, James and I would not have been friends, and noted that many friendships were created as a result of his largesse. He remembered our sail to Oyster Bay that day. I then told him that James and I had tried to live what we deemed the Buckley life. We defined the Buckley life as waking at 5 a.m. in the morning and heading to sleep at 10 p.m., Bill's incredible regimen. I explained to Bill that in order to make it work, James and I would call one another at 5 a.m. to make sure the other was awake. It lasted for barely 2 weeks. Bill roared with laughter. Bill soon said, "We must talk about your performance, the issue of repeats in the Diabelli Variations. What do you think?" The Diabelli Variations is an hour-long epic work, and almost all of the 33 variations are repeated. Bill's question brought a smile to my face, and I said, "Bill, I'll only repeat the best ones, and it should clock in at about 40 minutes. He then told me about the guests who would attend the concert, asked of my preference to play before or after dinner. I always played before dinner, and finally asked if I would like some cognac. We finished up dessert, which for me consisted of a lemon tart, and for Bill, a plate of fresh watermelon. The lighting in the music room and throughout the house always created an effect that I can only describe as that found in Victorian-era paintings. Bill gave his 2 Cavalier King Charles Spaniels chocolate chip cookie they had obviously been expecting. One played with the cookie on the floor between the two of us. Bill adored his dogs, and the newest edition was just 5 months old. Just after 8 o'clock, Bill bid us goodnight, and I helped him to make his way to his room. The Diabelli Variations were never performed on Wednesday night, February 27th. Bill passed away that morning in his study, a bar that he converted into a miniature Sistine chapel of conservatism with countless books and papers. I was practicing Beethoven in the house while he was writing about Reagan in his study. I was honored to have ever played for Mr. Buckley, who on his insistence became my friend Bill. His love of music was second to none. He was the most dedicated member of any musical audience, whose empathy was almost tangible as you worked your way through a performance. He was and is in the pantheon of great men, intellectual giants, and artistic geniuses. It was all a great honor to have had my life changed and enriched by William F. Buckley, Jr.
You're not going to have a chance to experience the ways because I promised that you would play the fantasy through. And that I think that means you have to begin doing it about now.
All right.
You will play it the right way, I assume.
Well, I will take 1 minute to show you. I will play just one bar of how it's being done in the past. That's one way. Another way has been this.
So as a palate cleanser, I hope listening to that you could reflect on what we heard and on maybe on our own lives, thinking on this man's life. What we're going to do next for the next 25 minutes is invite the panelists to join us up here and to open up the mic. First, I've asked at least 3 colleagues at King's College from different departments to bring questions. So I think Professor Dr. David Tubbs, who teaches constitutional law, is going to start things off, and then Professor Lisi, my colleague in journalism, and our provost, Dr. Mark Hijla, have questions, and then we're going to open up the mic. So I welcome the panelists to join us up here. We got some mics that should be...
I wanted to compliment all the panelists on such fine presentations. 2 of the panelists spoke on politics, 2 spoke on culture, so I wanted to pose a question that attempts to combine them. We know that Mr. Buckley launched the conservative movement following the Second World War, and he was also devoted to the cause of high culture. And I wanted to ask broadly whether there was some connection in Mr. Buckley's eyes between the success of the conservative movement and what we might call middle-brow culture. That is, does the success of the conservative movement in the future depend on having a more elevated kind of popular entertainment or popular culture than we do right now?
That's a great question. I do think middle brow is a good way to describe National Review traditionally. But Bill was an interesting combination because, as Lauren points out, he had this populist element to him, the famous quote about the Boston phone book. If you think about that mayoral campaign that he ran in 1965, he really found the Reagan working class constituency before Reagan, and arguably, the Trump constituency before Trump. If Fred Trump, Donald's father, who was a real estate developer in Queens, voted in that election, he almost surely, I would think, voted for Bill Buckley. But he was also an elitist and an institutionalist, right? No one was more devoted to his alma mater than Bill Buckley, which is why he'd be so proud and delighted with Lauren's project at Yale. And I think just listening to that last bit from Firing Line, can anyone imagine that airing on TV today, on Fox News at 9 o'clock or whatever? No, and I think this is just an important element of Bill's project that has been lost and in some respects unrecoverable, at least in a kind of a mass sense. I think the guardrails are down and the standards are lost. And again, Lawrence mentions, I listened very closely to your remarks, Lauren, obviously, mentions kind of the cop on the beat role that Buckley's National Review had, where we would expel the Birchers or anti-Semites, and that role is just almost impossible to fulfill today because of the great technological profusion of journalism and opinion. So Milo Yiannopoulos, for instance, there's a craze over him 2 or 3 years ago. We never had any use for him. We never published him. We criticized him constantly, but it didn't matter. It would have mattered 30 years ago, but there are just so many ways to go around institutions now. And sadly, just the more important decision about Milo and his standing in our public debate was made by Twitter. As long as he had a Twitter account, he had influence, and as soon as they cut him off, you basically never heard of him again. So this is a very important element of Bill's project that I think is kind of in tatters, frankly.
Well, I would say, for one thing, that clip, we talk about the golden age of television. That's the golden age of television, not now. That was incredible. You're absolutely right. We don't have the gatekeepers anymore the way we did once. I see that in my own role as an art critic. It makes much less of an impact, what I think of an artwork, than, let's say, what a critic would have thought 30 years ago. And it's purely because of this kind of social media populism that has taken over. I don't think there's ever going to be a restoration of it. I also don't think Bill would have necessarily expected there to be one. His populism was interesting. I think that quote about the telephone directory was more a slam of the Harvard faculty than saying that the Boston telephone directory had great people in it. Because I'll take even these guys. Although someone did mention that if it is the first names in the Boston telephone directory, they'd all be Adamses. So maybe you get some good people.
I agree with all that's been said. One thing that's interesting to think about, though, is I think Firing Line had pretty meager ratings towards the end of its life when it stopped in 1999. And Heather Hendershot at MIT has a book on Firing Line, and I think I remember reading some in there somewhere else that Buckley was almost kind of proud of the lower ratings because he was speaking to he was hoping to reach an audience of a certain intellectual level. But is that recoverable? There's so much niche television nowadays. You can watch. There's all sorts of channels that I never watched. So I've never understood why why there wouldn't be enough of a demand out there for something that Buckley offered.
And just a quick thought on this. That clip, by the way, was Rosalind Turek, one of the great pianists and great friends of Bill's, actually, who appeared on Firing Line on a number of occasions. And actually, he chose 4 people to be on his last Firing Line, and one of the 4 was Rosalind Turek. And I had the honor, while I was working on my project for Bill, he invited me to Firing Line whenever I wanted to go, and I went on a few occasions, including for the last episode. And when you do think about it, today that would be impossible even on PBS, and PBS supposedly still has a mission of some sort, when it comes to culture, and you can't even have a program on there where you're going to have 10 minutes of uninterrupted classical music. And I've dedicated myself in many ways, because of Bill, to going out and trying to claim a piece of media firmament or landscape for something like classical music, which would have been very important for Bill, and he did his part. He did something in a public affairs program that no one else would have done. And I think it does come back to editors, it comes back to publishers, it comes back to producers to kind of remember the roots and responsibility that we have, that they have, to include this programming, whether, saying, let's just put it on YouTube, where Firing Line really lives today on YouTube, or on programs that are watched by people in, let's say, the 500 channel universe, or what remains of it. So that's an important responsibility that anyone has on editorial decision in whatever part of the media landscape we're dealing with.
One of my other favorite clips of Firing Line having to do with music is, Bill had people across the spectrum on the program, obviously, and he had Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet, and Ginsberg actually performed the Hare Krishna for Bill, and Bill was kind of waiting impatiently for this to end, and after it was over said, "That's the most unhurried Krishna I've ever heard."
I will also say that he was a master of television, and television was a mass medium. And beyond even Firing Line, think about the millions that he reached through the 1968 convention debates with Gore Vidal. I think it's a controversial film, but the documentary Best of Enemies, in my opinion, does tell a very good story of that very interesting time.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I spent 15 years at the New York Post, and I had the honor of writing Buckley's obit when I was there, so tonight feels like a full circle for me. But I have a religion question. Buckley was a very devout Catholic. How did his faith influence his politics? And if alive today, what would he think of Pope Francis?
As at least one Protestant on the panel, I'm not probably not the best suited to answer this question. When Bill was thinking of who he's going to choose as the next editor when my predecessor, John O'Sullivan, left, I never made any representations of this nature myself, but a colleague of mine said, Bill was kind of interested in my religion, and a colleague of mine said, "Oh yeah, Rich is interested in Catholicism." I guess I'm still interested in Catholicism, but I'm still not a Catholic. I don't know whether any of other panelists want to take this up.
I think, well, for one thing, he was observant much more than I think we even realize. He went to a Latin Mass, I believe, at least once a week, often with my colleague Roger Kimball. I think his Catholicism and love of God very much influenced his anti-communism, and I think it was the root of his anti-communism and the reason he would never accept any kind of détente with the Soviet Union.
I'm Jewish. I'm married to a Catholic, but I will say it's interesting. There's that one passage in Up from Liberalism, which there's an often cited passage sort of where he defines conservatism, and I recall part of that was he talked about that he meant to live his life as an obedient man, but obedient to God and subservient to the wisdom of his ancestors. So, but that's all I have to offer on that.
I'm also Jewish, and having grown up as a Jewish kid in the Midwest and ending up in New York City with one of the great Catholics of the last 50 years as a friend, was always very interesting. But I can't really answer that question, but one thing, if we're here to give insight on Bill, let's say that his generosity, you were talking about gratitude, and his book Gratitude. I think that he could have written a book on generosity as well, because in his final days, there are a number of anecdotes out there of Bill just writing checks to friends and sending them around. He also put the children of the people who worked for him, maids, gardeners, others, through school, through Catholic school, maybe even through other school, but we know that all these stories have been corroborated, and he never looked for any thank you. He never looked for a single thank you, and I think for the very first encounter after I met Bill the first time when I came back to New York City and I played for the editors the first time in December 2000, I went in, I played the Beethoven Opus 110 Piano Sonata, which is great work he loves so much, and he asked me on 3 days' notice. He said, "What are you working on? Can you do it?" I said, "Yes, I can." I went, I practiced all weekend, I played. Rich was there, I'm sure you were, and a few days later I get a check in the mail for $500 from Bill. And I called him up immediately and I said, "Bill, I can't accept any money. You have to understand, it's an honor for me to play piano for you and for the editors." And he said to me, "Listen, this is the least that I can do, and I'm a writer. I expect to be paid for my writing. And at the end of the day, I have a vocation, I have an avocation." So his idea of generosity was one I think we can all learn from, and if that's rooted in his Catholicism, that's a great thing.
I'm Mark Hidgley, I'm the provost here at King's, and I just want to add my thanks to you for giving us such great insights into Bill Buckley. I never met him, but I know him better now because of you tonight. Thank you. I'm also a professor of music here at King's, and I was supposed to ask the music question, but I think we've already touched on that a little bit. So I want to try one more time from a slightly different perspective this question about the cultural project, and just throw out 3 words here: imagination, edification, and education. And those are, maybe the last one will pique your interest more than the others at this point in the conversation, but if Bill Buckley were standing here, would he give up on the cultural project, or would he perhaps talk about the reason he wrote spy novels but also loved J.S. Bach, and what role education might play in the cultural project?
Well, he wasn't the giving up type, and one of his another effect of his faith was he was kind of a cosmic optimist who always said to despair is to sin. So he wouldn't despair on this project, and I'm sure I would guess his view would be that we need to preserve the high points of our civilization and the appreciation of them, at least to have a saving remnant that still believes and understands. And this obviously should be a role of our education system, but it's amazing to think that he wrote his excoriating attack on what was then political correctness, although it wasn't called that, in the 1950s. You know, he saw that slide, and it's only gotten worse year by year, and it's just important to have charter schools, to have places like King's College in Hillsdale and various oases of programs and departments at other schools that still teach our history, teach our civilization, and teach our culture. And I think doing that has to be one of the top 5
priorities, at least of contemporary conservatism.
Larry, you should talk about the grant you got.
So in 1998, when I met Bill for the second time, really, he surprised me by asking me this question, whether or not I wanted to work on a research project for him. And I actually wrote him this second letter that I wrote to him. I said I wanted to do for classical music that which he had done for conservatism in America. And I think that caught his attention. And he had a very romantic idea of education, of, let's say, someone tells him his friend Skylar Chapin, who was the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for the City of New York under Giuliani, mentioned to him over lunch in 1998. He said, music education is being reintroduced in the city schools after 30 years. And Bill said, it's been out of the city schools for the last 30 years. How is that even possible? And Chapin explained that now, there was this project through the Annenberg Foundation. They were bringing all this money in, and they were matching the grants and everything. And he happened to receive this letter from me at the same time. And so he said to me, how would you like to go into the city schools and take a look at what they're doing with this money? And the reintroduction of, let's say, Bach, Beethoven, Verdi, et cetera, into city schools. So I went in, and of course I realized that this was a romantic idea. None of this was actually happening. When you got down into it, one person's definition of culture or art education was another person's definition of popular culture or something else. So it was not actually happening, but he had this idea that maybe kids were studying Bach and Beethoven all throughout the city schools. So that was unfortunate, but it showed the romantic side of it. And I agree entirely with Rich. I think that we can't give up. And I think that in many ways, the irony when we talk about China and all of the frightening aspects of life under a regime like that my parents left in the Soviet Union, many times those are the countries that are investing heavily in culture and sometimes even Western culture. There are more kids playing piano in China today than there are kids in America. So I think when we look at that, it's a tough nut to crack, and Bill would say we have to keep fighting for it. I think charter schools and Catholic education and Western civilization, all of those kind of things that are very unpopular in some areas are the way to go.
Well, and I would say the project of cultural recovery was a project that he was engaged with his whole life. Everything he wrote, there was always something to remember. And I think it's an outcome that we are living in an age of critical thinking. This is the John Dewey, how to think. The problem is we don't know why should we think or what should we think about. And I think there was always something for Bill to recover there. And that's how he's able to write 2 columns a week. There was something that needed to be remembered. One question I would like to ask, while I have these panelists here, is there one Buckley essay out of all others that should be remembered? Let's say you're on a desert island, you could have one Buckley essay. What would that essay be? It's a tough question.
By the way, I think when he started his column, he was writing 5 times a week.
Wow.
And at least he went down to 3, and then finally 2. And one reason he could write was that he had these important priorities he wanted to recover. Another was that he was just fast as hell. I mean, at his height, he was writing columns in 20 minutes, right? So I would say, one, this is not what you asked, James, but I would say Up From Liberalism is the most important entree to Bill's books, and I think stands up incredibly well. And in terms of essay, I will say Speech, which is the speech on gratitude that I mentioned, and it is really at, you're talking about recovery and appreciation for the roots of our culture and civilization, but a huge element of it is being grateful for it. And if you appreciate it and you're grateful for it, that motivates you to preserve it and pass it on to the next generation, which is obviously at the root of the conservative project.
In terms of a favorite column, I have to say the compilations. For me, the life changer was Happy Days We're Here Again, where he was kind of looking back at the 80s during the Clinton years. And it was the book that I was reading when I wrote to him. And in that book, he had a couple essays on learning Bach Piano Concerto for a Phoenix Symphony benefit concert he was going to give. And just one little anecdote out of that was Bill, being as busy as he was, took the shortest possible concerto to learn, took the number of notes in it and divided it by the number of days that he had, and tried to figure out how many hours he would have to practice. And of course, that became very difficult, and every piano teacher told him, "You're on a fool's errand." But he ended up doing it, to his credit, so never giving up.
I mean, I like up from liberalism. Also, I remember reading his collection of speeches that's let us talk of many things. What I enjoyed about that is, I think Buckley always had a way of being able to put maybe even complicated concepts in a simple yet witty way. I mean, certainly big vocabulary words, but yeah, that's
And let's thank our panel one more time for their excellent remarks.